Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's education buy-in webinar on below threshold tenders should you collaborate. Now, since the Procurement Act 2023 came into force, we know many schools have been asking what's changed for us and can we still collaborate when buying goods and services. So over the next 30 minutes, we're going to unpack what below threshold procurement means for schools and explore collaborative options and show you how frameworks, dynamic purchasing systems and MAT-wide approaches can simplify your processes, save time and deliver better value. So before we dive into some of the most common questions, if you do have any questions, please can you pop it in the chat and we'll answer them either at the end of the webinar or as we go along. Good morning, Nathan.
Good morning, Victoria. Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. I can't believe it's November, nearly the end of 2025, folks. Where is time going?
It's flying. It is, literally.
It certainly is. It certainly is. Yeah. Good.
Right,
yeah.
Nathan. So we do hear the term below threshold quite a lot when it comes to procurement. But what does it actually mean under the new Procurement Act 2023, and why is it important for schools to understand?
Yeah, great question. And this is something that comes up quite often as a question as well. So it's great we're tackling this particular one. So, folks, the Procurement Act 2023 came into force in February. So, I mean, it's not far away from coming up to a year, which is, I mean, time seems to be flying. That's why I sort of mentioned that earlier. But one of the interesting things around the Procurement Act is what we call below threshold procurement. So when we talk about below threshold contracts under the Procurement Act, we're simply talking about procurements that fall under the official threshold limits or spending limits that are set by the government. So those are set every 2 years. And interestingly, this January, they were last set in January 2024. And the threshold was goods and services, circa 214,000. For works or construction, 5.3 million, and that is inclusive of VAT, and that's a real important point. But those thresholds are set every 2 years, and as mentioned, those were set in January 24. So we are expecting those thresholds to be reviewed and potentially updated come January, this coming January in 2026. So just to make that point, really important point about the thresholds, and then I'm sure Victoria can put something out on our channels around what those thresholds are when those are updated, if they're updated. However, those thresholds are cut-off points, effectively, where the full rigour of the Procurement Act and the procurement rules kick in. So if you're below that threshold, let's talk about goods and services, so 214,000, I think 904 there or thereabouts. Then if you're below that limit, bearing in mind that's also inclusive of VAT, then your process, your procurement can be much more simpler and more proportionate. But you still need to obviously show value for money and fairness. So it's obviously still a public procurement. So it's really also important to remember that the threshold isn't based on your annual spend. It's the whole life value of the contract. And that means you need to include everything: VAT, optional extensions, likely renewals, add-ons, etc. So just by way of example, Victoria, if you're signing a 3-year cleaning contract at, let's say, 60,000 a year, you don't just consider the 60,000 for the first year. You would look at the 180,000 over the 3 years plus VAT. And that total determines whether it's above or below the threshold. Now, if you add in 2 extra years of extensions on that, then you can easily see how it triggers the over threshold procurement requirements. So understanding where your procurement sits helps you to choose the right route to market and the right process. So if it's above threshold, schools are and MATs are duty bound to follow the full rigour of the Procurement Act. That's open, compliant tendering, and there's multiple processes that you can apply in that sense. So we do a separate training, folks, on PA23. Highly recommend that. So I won't go into that. But if it's below threshold, which is what the question is, you do have more flexibility. So, for example, getting quotes or using a compliant framework, but you still need to be transparent and fair. So it's actually for schools, one of the things with the Procurement Act is you're not bound to follow the full rigor of the rules below threshold. So in other words, you don't have to run a full tender, but it's good practice to seek competitive quotes, keep records of your decisions, and use compliant routes such as frameworks where possible, which I think we'll be unpacking in the next few slides.
That's really clear overview. Thanks, Nathan. So what does that actually look like day to day for schools, and how does it work in practice when schools are running below threshold procurements?
Yeah, procurement's a hard word for some people. It's yeah. Well, what does this mean in practice? Well, the Procurement Act 23 introduces a new set of rules actually for smaller contracts. This is new, and it's what's called the below threshold procedures. But those are mainly aimed at central government, local authorities, other public bodies. Schools and academies, multi-academy trusts are specifically excluded, which is great. So it's one of those occasions where you want to be excluded from something, from those below threshold sections of the Act. So I won't go into what the requirements of that means in terms of what other organisations have to do for below threshold, but it does involve more advertisements and more notices that are placed. But because it doesn't apply to you guys, then we don't need to go into the specifics of that. And that means your day-to-day procurement activity for lower value procurement isn't changing as such in a legal sense. So you don't suddenly have new procedures to follow. So what does that mean for you? Well, in practice, the sort of three key things. You don't have to publish your below threshold tenders on the Contracts Finder procurement platform. You do have to still follow, however, your own internal rules or your own procurement policy, your trust's financial regulations, or whatever it is. You must still act fairly, transparently, and obviously demonstrate value for money. Who wouldn't want that? So while the Act doesn't apply directly to below threshold, the principles behind it, fairness, openness, accountability, absolutely still do. So, yeah, even though you're not bound by the Act, following good procurement practice is the best way to stay compliant, get good deals, and show you're spending public money responsibly. Best practice steps might include things like getting multiple quotes. I'm sure everybody does that for anything significant. Again, that just protects you from any sort of challenge or conflicts of interest around ensuring that you get competitive quotations, and that helps show value for money. Be clear and fair. Obviously, just avoid writing specs that only one possible supplier can meet. Think green, think sustainable. You've got a great opportunity with school procurement to engage with local providers and local suppliers, and that we've seen some great examples of that through education buying. Obviously, keep evidence, save your quotes, evaluation notes, and your decision records, and that could be really important during audits or when reporting to governors or the ESFA. And obviously, these actions line up perfectly with your existing obligations under things like the Academy Trust Handbook, or in the case of maintained schools, your local authorities' financial regulations. So even if the law specifically doesn't require you to follow the full rigors of below threshold, there's still best practice, and that helps keep you safe and consistent with procurement expectations.
So that gives us a sense of what best practice looks like, but it also raises an interesting question. If these below threshold tenders are exempt from some of the formal rules, some people might wonder why collaborate at all. So what's the real benefit for schools in working together on these smaller contracts?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a great question. So even those small below threshold procurements don't have to follow the full procurement process. Collaborating or collaboration or aggregation still delivers big benefits, especially for schools like I'm sure the ones we've got on today that are trying to manage budgets, save money, obviously stay compliant, etc., other priorities. So why does collaboration still matter? Well, it gives you better value for money. So when schools combine their spend, obviously you can negotiate lower prices and better terms from suppliers. Buying together increases purchasing power, and suppliers are more likely to offer discounts or extras, less admin and risk. So, for example, working through a framework or a dynamic purchasing system, which we'll come on to those shortly, means a lot of the work is done around due diligence, supplier vetting, compliance, and therefore it saves you time writing specs, because a lot of these come with templates and best practice documents and evaluation scoring notes and things like that. And it enables you to just concentrate on the offer itself without worrying about a lot of the admin that goes around that. Obviously, more leverage. So yes, we talked about value for money, but increasing your sort of collaboration makes you actually more attractive to the suppliers, and in turn that gives you more likely for them to prioritize you and offer better terms. Shared expertise, aggregating with others, means you can access wider expertise and shared experience. So sometimes we're not always the best people to know how to write a spec or what things to include, and obviously having collaboration means that you've got lots of different people's views and experience that you can take advantage of. Obviously, it's more likely to support sustainability goals. So collaboration allows schools to collectively choose perhaps more sustainable suppliers. It might support net zero commitments, etc. And it makes sustainable options more affordable and ultimately future proofing. So the Procurement Act brings new transparency in reporting expectations, but schools that collaborate will be better prepared if thresholds on reporting duties change in the future.
Thanks, Nathan. That makes a lot of sense, and it leads us nicely into the different ways collaboration can actually take shape. So we know that collaboration can take lots of different forms, from sharing information to joint tenders. But what are some of the practical ways schools can actually collaborate on procurement?
Yeah, sure. So there's different ways that schools can collaborate. It isn't a one size fits all. It can be as simple as just two departments sharing an order, or as strategic as several schools creating a joint contract. So we tend to talk about 4 levels of collaboration. Depends on how formalized and how structured those are. I mean, the simple one is internally, and I see this a lot with multi-academy trusts, particularly where it's what we call a decentralized procurement operating model, where within a MAT, every school is doing their own thing, and every purchase is made sort of very independently. So this really is a good starting point if that sort of represents where you're at. And that is around looking at certain categories that could be collaborated internally. Classic ones are things like stationery. Obviously, we all know about catering and cleaning, but perhaps grounds maintenance, perhaps janitorial supplies. There are common categories that would apply that are not school specific. So a great way of doing that is sort of looking at what are those internal school to school purchases that are happening, and that obviously creates benefits of bulk savings, less duplication, stronger control over budgets and supplies. Again, it increases leverage and makes you more attractive to the market. So that's a great one for MATs, where central teams can aggregate demand across academies, and we're seeing that increasingly as MATs are formalizing their procurement and procurement strategies. The next one is sort of more formal collaboration, which are between trusts and between schools. So schools or trusts agree to align their procurement processes or sign some form of joint purchasing agreement. So you could have a cluster of academies creating one tender, let's say for grounds maintenance, cleaning, and that's managed by a lead school. So there has to be a lead contracting authority in those cases, and then effectively they're acting as a central purchasing body on behalf of the other schools. And we're talking about separate MATs here that can coordinate together. Obviously, again, that offers stronger buying power, particularly for, again, those common purchases and common categories. The third one, the classic one, which is beloved by many, is frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. So these are compliant existing routes to market, as we call them. This is where the hard work around supplier vetting, compliance, checks, legal documentation, it's already done. And obviously education buying, we have a number of frameworks that are widely used for various categories. So you can then simply call off from the framework in some cases place a direct order without having to do any competitive bidding because that competitive bidding's already done, or in some cases where it's a little bit more complex, things like catering, cleaning, where it's services, you run what's called a further competition or a mini tender, where it's still a competitive process and it's still fully compliant, but you're not having to do the full process. You're not having to do a lot of the supplier, the advertising, the supplier due diligence, etc. It's straight to the offer, and that's great. And that's ideal for things like below threshold spend as well, because it ensures fair competition without having to be disproportionate over the process. Over the size of the procurement and how complex it is. Supplier partnerships is another one where once you've found, great suppliers who understand your needs, it's about building a long-term relationship and a long-term partnership. Again, compliance is really important here, but a lot of cases suppliers are chosen very ad hoc and swapped out, and actually sometimes it can be better to work with suppliers over a longer period who then really get to know your school, really get to understand your needs, and you can introduce things like innovation, continual improvement, and obviously work to a better outcome over the long term.
And schools are collaborating more and more, and whether that's through shared contracts, joint tenders, or even informal networks, how does that kind of collaboration develop over time from simple coordination to really joined up systems?
Yeah, sure. We are seeing that. And I think a lot of that is down to schools taking a more strategic approach to procurement, and something that we're working with a lot of MATs and schools on, and that's increasingly so. There are a number of tools that schools and MATs can use to identify collaboration opportunities. And like I say, those are very strategic tools. So things like having a contracts register that you can review and look at what contracts you've got coming up for renewal, and that gives you time. Time is the best friend of procurement, as I always say. So if you know you've got contracts coming up within the next year that need to be renewed, that gives you time to look at and explore collaboration opportunities, both within the MAT, but also with other trusts and MATs as well. That leads to a forward procurement plan where you know what the route to market will be. You've identified we're going to collaborate on this one, or we're going to go out to market on that one, etc. A useful tool to help with all that is spend analysis, particularly around things like tail end spend. So tail end spend is where you're spending a lot of money at a low value but repeated. So we see a lot of that with things like use of Amazon and online spends and bits and pieces every so often. And again, that over time can add up, and that's where, again, that's a classic one for potential accessing of existing deals and frameworks where actually buying together might be a better outcome for that. Awareness of regional and national deals. There's obviously public sector buying organisations like ourselves as Education Buying, where there are great deals available and you can simply access those, and that is collaboration because you're accessing existing arrangements. Sharing best practice. So I'm sure you're all you're all on this webinar. I'm sure you're all part of networks and groups where you can say, we've just got a really good deal on this. And that's, again, really important to, we're all trying to work to the common good on these things. And that's a great way of sharing where there's opportunities. And again, accessing things like e-tendering portals. And I know this is quite, this is an interesting one for MATs. Not many MATs use e-tendering, but again, this is a tool where you can set up collaboration opportunities and look at what's available out there across the public sector and what's been awarded and what frameworks are available. So again, those portals are really useful for that as well.
Okay. So once schools start collaborating, how can they tell it's really making a difference? So what signs should they be looking for that collaboration is actually working and adding value?
Yeah. What gets measured gets managed, as we always say. So benchmarking and measuring success. Well, the obvious one is cost. So our price is improving. So it's the obvious and easiest measure. Compare the prices you're paying now to what you paid before. but make sure you can comparing like for like. Obviously, is it the same spec, same quantity, same service level, for example? You could, for example, track the cost per box of paper or per meal or per cleaning hour, and check whether those joint orders or frameworks have reduced your overall whole life contract cost, not just the annual spend, and review whether price increases have slowed compared to market averages. So obviously cost data gives you a tangible way to show savings and justify those collaborative purchasing decisions. Quality, are things improving? Are service levels consistent? So obviously savings aren't everything. They're useful, but they're not everything. So benchmarking also means tracking quality and reliability. How responsive suppliers are? Are they delivering on time? Are the products or services meeting your agreed standards? So some examples could be recording delivery times, fault rates, satisfaction surveys, and comparing performance between suppliers or across schools. Using a shared supplier scorecard could be an example there. Obviously, noting any recurring issues or trends and feed them back to a wider group that perhaps use that framework, and that again just helps. And all that collaboration doesn't just drive down cost, it maintains and improves that service quality. Value for money, obviously, yes, related to cost, but it's about the overall saving. It's about the total cost over the contract's lifetime. So how much time are you spending on admin, chasing invoices, managing contracts individually versus collectively? So time saved through centralized ordering or shared contract management is really a good outcome from collaboration. Reduce duplication of effort when one person manages that one contract for multiple schools. It takes effort and work off people's desks, and that's great, and it helps people to concentrate on, I would say, the day job, but procurement should be the day job as well. Sustainability is the other one. Are you reducing impact, or are you making positive outcomes? And something that we've recently audited across some of our catering and cleaning suppliers, we've seen some fantastic examples of sustainability, which has been delivered as a result of some of the great collaboration that we've facilitated through education buy-in. So, again, examples could be fewer supplier deliveries, meaning reduced carbon emissions, bulk ordering, reducing packaging and transport waste, prioritizing energy efficient solutions, etc., etc. So there's lots of great ways of benchmarking. Benchmarking turns collaboration effectively from what appears to be a good idea into a proven strategy, and obviously should be part of any procurement strategy for a trust.
It's encouraging. And it's great to have some tangible ways to measure the impact. And finally, for schools that want to get started, what are the simplest and most compliant routes to begin collaborating on procurement?
Sure. So obviously when you're collaborating, naturally what that does, just thinking of the thresholds that we discussed earlier, obviously if you're collaborating, then that may increase your spend and therefore trigger some of those thresholds. So not to get confused with below threshold and over threshold, but obviously if you're aggregating your spend and demand across a number of schools, then that could likely trigger those over thresholds. So one of the easiest ways of over threshold collaboration is through the use, as we've mentioned, of existing solutions and routes to market, which include frameworks which are pre-tendered, compliant with public contract regulations, and that you can access straight away. So it's really important that you check any frameworks that they are set up specifically for education, for schools. Not all of them are. So you do need to raise that question. I can guarantee education buy-in is, because it's MATs that set up our frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. It's by schools for schools. So they are the only education specific frameworks available. So, and they've been competitively tendered thoroughly through, obviously, a public sector buying organisation. So you don't need to run your own full procurement. Similarly, the dynamic purchasing system. So this is effectively a bit like a live open version of a framework where you've got a list of approved suppliers for various categories, and new suppliers can join at any time as long as they meet the minimum requirements. So there is a supplier vetting and due diligence process. So, for example, for education buy-in, we have dynamic purchasing systems for cleaning and catering, for MIS, FMS budgeting, HR payroll and audit. So often schools come to us and say, we'd like to use that, but we'd also like to invite our incumbent provider. And if they're not on that list, then they can apply to be on that list prior to going out to tender. But you also get the benefit of that, as well as accessing a range of pre-vetted and pre-approved suppliers. And it all comes then down to the deal. So you still make the final decision, but it's about evaluating the outcome and the offer, not necessarily going through all the full evaluation of suppliers. And then I guess it's MAT wide and things like cluster contracts. And this is something that many schools are now sort of realising, particularly with the growth of MATs, where combining spend across your trust, as we mentioned earlier, improves economies of scale, reduces overheads and management, etc. That does require things like standardising specifications, but the great advantage of that is everyone's buying on the same terms at the same quality level. It's easier for finance teams, for example, to monitor spend, manage renewals, report savings. Works beautifully for common categories like ICT, energy, where it's not school specific. And these contracts can be run under a framework as well as a DPS, as your own joint tender, or you could run it as obviously a full compliant bespoke procurement. So it's about choosing the route that best fits your situations. Frameworks offer that direct award option, often where you can just have speed and simplicity, just raise an order as long as it meets your need, ticks the box. DPSs, if you want that sort of flexibility and local choice, so you can add local suppliers, again, as long as they meet the minimum needs, the minimum requirements, and then MAT-wide contracts if you want scale and strategic control.
Yeah, I am sure you'll all find it reassuring to know that there are clear compliant routes you can take. Of course, schools don't have to do this on their own. There are lots of support available to help you get collaboration right from the start. So on that note, let's take a look at how education buy-in can support you.
Yep, so we can help identify collaborative opportunities. So we could spot areas where you can combine purchasing with other schools, and I've done this quite a lot. We could do spend analysis, for example, look at opportunities where across the trust and across the school you could gain better value and help you coordinate tenders that could benefit from those economies of scale. Obviously, we've got a lot of experience around insight into which categories are best suited for collaboration as well. Obviously, as mentioned, we've got access to compliant frameworks and DPS. So we have offers on our pre-vetted suppliers and frameworks that do meet, are compliant with public procurement regulations, which reduces your risk. And we can guide you in using dynamic purchasing systems for ongoing or your flexible procurement needs, ensuring that your procurement approach is fully compliant with public contract regulations and the Procurement Act and other legal requirements. We can also benchmark current spend, so compare your contracts and expenditure against similar organisations, highlight potential savings and efficiency improvements, and provide data-driven insights to inform strategic procurement decisions. And we could support training for those of you who have procurement as part of your day job. So that could be offering practical training on writing compliant policies, tendering, managing contracts, and just help to equip you with the confidence you need to make better procurement decisions. That could also involve providing you with templates, guidance, and tools to simplify those everyday procurement tasks. So it's about making compliance easy and collaboration practical. And as mentioned, we're seeing a lot of this now, and a lot of trusts are working with us to engage with this sort of better way of doing procurement.
We would also really like to understand where you'd find the most value from support. So if you could take a moment, I can see some people have already responded to the quick poll that popped up on your screen. Just let us know which areas you'd like more help with. And those that have already submitted their vote, thank you for sharing that, because it is always helpful for us to see where skills need the most support so we can tailor our future sessions around that. And if you are looking to build your confidence in procurement, don't forget we also offer a range of procurement training sessions designed specifically for schools. They're a great way to make sure you are up to date, especially with the new Procurement Act changes. So we have popped the link into the chat if you would like to book yourself on any of those sessions. We do have a couple of questions, so we're going to come to them in a second. So just to note that I have spotted them and we're not ignoring you.
How much are those sessions, Victoria? Sorry.
Yeah, there's £79, and it's for I think it's between 2.5 and 3 hours training.
Delivered by yours truly, and I promise folks they're not boring or dull. I know procurement isn't everyone's cup of tea, but they are really worthwhile. So, and it's a steal. I'm going to say that, but it is a steal at £79. So just yes, yeah, do consider those.
Yeah. And finally, we do have more webinars coming up covering other key areas of school procurement. So do keep an eye on our updates and also join us for those too. Each one is short, practical and focused on helping you get the best value and stay compliant. Right, before we wrap up, Nathan, we're just going to do the couple of questions that we've had. One is, how do we check a framework is education sector compliant?
Yes, good question. So any public sector framework will start life as a contract notice or a tender notice, and within that, and this is the notice, the transparency notice that is published, that effectively informs the market and the wider world that there is a procurement commencing, and within that there should be a list of organisations that can access that. Often it is like, it just says the education sector or all schools, and it'll give a link to the DFE. So that's one way of checking, and I appreciate that's sometimes quite difficult to find. Often where there are frameworks, then they are advertised on websites and things like that, and they have associated user guides or downloads. Again, that's worth checking. Or otherwise simply raise the question and just say, you know, this is who I am. Can I just check that I am scoped in to access that particular framework? So in the majority of cases, a lot of public sector frameworks are what we call pan-government. So they are applicable for whether you're central government, local authority, justice, prison service, housing, hospitals, and obviously, yeah, schools and education, but some can be just specific. So it is worth just checking, because if you do end up trying to access one of those that you are not scoped into, then that could trip you up from a compliance perspective. And ultimately, it is your responsibility to check that as the contracting authority in that case.
And the next question, Nathan, leads really nicely from that point. And it's when a contract is procured through a framework, is there an obligation by the trust to publish a contract notice on the central digital platform?
So not a contract notice. So when a contract is procured through a framework, yeah. So if you've run a mini tender or a further competition through there, then it's a good idea, yes, transparency, to place award notices to notify that you've obviously awarded a contract through there. So yes, that is good practice to do. But obviously a contract notice is what commences the procurement, so you wouldn't need to do that because obviously that's already been done.
Perfect. Any pointers for solo procurement using community-owned organisations instead of commercial providers?
Interestingly, I'd say solar procurement is certainly a growing area. There's a lot more sustainable and energy related frameworks and procurements out there. I would suggest, again, just do the due diligence on looking at existing frameworks around that. Using community-owned organisations instead of commercial providers. You're still spending public money, so I would suggest that the Procurement Act still applies regardless of the nature of the provider. Obviously, there will be certain different due diligence checks involved there, but ultimately it's still a public procurement. So I would say it still requires a full process if it's over the threshold, obviously. But there will be, I think there are growing suitable frameworks out there around solar. I don't have any examples, but I'm sure if you did some research, you could find them.
And our final question is, can I have some advice around purchases, i.e. over the course of the academic year, e.g. carpets might be purchased at various different points at different schools during the year. The lifetime of these would be significant, but they are a one-off purchase and could, when added together, go over the threshold. What rules would apply here for purchases?
Yeah, this is a real tricky one, isn't it? It's a bit of a grey area. So obviously, this comes back to procurement strategy and visibility. You've got to look at it from the potential of compliance risk. So are you spending repeatedly with the same supplier would be my first question. And if you are, then yes, potentially that could be considered to be breaching the regulations, because obviously had you foreseen all those needs and gone to done one procurement, then obviously it would be over threshold. The question is are those reactive procurements or are they planned? And if they are planned, then really it's what you ought to do, which is collaborate and aggregate exactly what we're saying and look at it as a whole life cost over the duration of the known need. So if you know you're going to need all these carpets to be replaced over the course of the school year, then strategically speaking, it's better to do a full procurement. I mean, that has advantages for not repeating the cost and time and admin of doing lots of repeat procurements, but also everything we've just said around, better leverage, buying power, savings, etc. But I do get that sometimes it's not all that organised. So and it can happen reactively, and I think in that case, don't worry too much. But again, just take a look when you're doing a bit, and the spend analysis will help with this. When you're looking back over a year and you go, we've spent over the threshold with one supplier, then looking forward, if you're planning to do that again, I would be suggesting that you need to look at that in a compliant context.
Thank you. So that brings us to
some great questions. Yes.
Yeah, there was. So that brings us to the end of today's session. So a big thank you to yourself, Nathan, for sharing your insights. And
always a pleasure. Thank you, folks.
Everyone who joined us this morning. We do hope you found it useful and that it has given you some ideas on how collaboration can really make below threshold procurement work better for schools.